Hi there, Sam.
Hey Bob, how you doing?
Doing great. Thank you for asking. Wondering,
Yep.
what are your thoughts on spike growth?
Oh, spike growth. Spike growth. Second level spell. Druid or ranger. It's fine. Spike growth is very niche. It is situational. It's the kind of thing you won't always use and you won't use for very much of the game. But when you use it, you'll be like, oh, that was cool. It's middle of the road to me. This is like what I consider a bread and butter, decent second level spell that I'm happy is in the game, but isn't changing how I play at all or anything like that.
All right, well, what are some situations when you would use it?
So the situations where the spike growth is good. You're a druid, obviously. As a ranger, it's a lot worse. But as a druid, um, you want to use it in positions where you've got a clear area you're trying to cut off from lots of small creatures. So it's at its best when you're dealing with mindless things like constructs and zombies. If you're fighting against golems, if you're fighting against, a lich's undead horde of brain-eating cretins, they're just going to run right through it and go through the paper shredder. Just take like 12d4 damage along the way. That's where you're going to get the most mileage out of it. It's definitely the spell that you're going to want in tight quarters. It's a spell you're going to want in environments that are specifically good with spike growth. 20-foot area may seem like a lot. In a lot of circumstances, in a lot of battle maps, especially as you get to the upper tiers, it's quite small. And you'll find that, it's like a fireball distance, and fireball's more consistent. So you don't really want it in areas or situations that have lots of room to navigate or against flying enemies, or there's just a lot more situations where it's bad than it's good. In the situations it's good though. In the situations where you do want to cast it, again, looking at tight quarters, we're looking at specific kinds of monsters, and the whole of it ends up being those situations you'll find happen relatively frequently early in the game. Whenever you're like levels 1 through 5, you're going to find them fairly often, tight dungeons and stuff. And then the later you go, the more you're in like, well, in this interdimensional giant upside down gravity's reversed elemental planar vortex, spike growth doesn't even have a platform to go on, and that's when it gets a little bit worse, and you probably aren't preparing it anymore.
Now, how about you mentioned the damage, but it also creates difficult terrain. How would you compare spike growth to something like sleet storm, for example?
So difficult terrain is hard. Difficult terrain is they're kind of different groups of how people run combat. There's the really introductory groups where it feels very much like a whiteboard, or not a whiteboard, a white room, where terrain isn't really considered all that much, distance isn't all that necessarily thought about, positioning isn't all that relevant. And in those situations, spike growth is often just like a block that the monsters walk around, or a block the monsters have to walk through. And difficult terrain in that context is not very useful. Once you get to like the middling stages where the DM is pretty competent, they practice a whole lot, they've done a lot of DMing, they've made a whole bunch of encounters and trying to shake things up. Distance becomes more than the 30-foot room that it's as close as people can get to melee combat, and that's when difficult terrain gets more interesting, because if it ever costs someone more than their movement to get to you, it's eaten actions. And as an action economy based game, that is an incredibly powerful way to get advantages. That's kind of where you want your difficult terrain to be. So with things like Sleet Storm and Spike Growth, if you can put a situation down where you're forcing something to use actions to get to you, you are in a good position. That's difficult terrain at its finest. And again, it's going to happen most of the time at lower levels whenever you aren't in widespread environments where you're fighting things that don't have varieties of movement speeds. So like a fly speed negates the difficult terrain entirely, right? Sleep Storm is a little bit better because at least it's vertical, but with Spike Growth, anything with a fly or climb speed just goes, okay, I don't give a shit. I'm going to go right over that. And you get nothing out of the deal from it. At the end of the day, though, difficult terrain is useful in that middling area. Once you get to like extremely challenging, high lethality, super munchkin-y stuff, we're looking at builds where teleportation has kind of given a lot of the time. You're looking at builds where you are expected to be able to handle things at ridiculous ranges and distances. You're competing with stuff like Sharpshooter. You're competing with like incredibly busted, powerful 120-foot range stuff. Difficult terrain in those windows. The monsters you're fighting are going to not need to be that close to you. The 20-foot area is a joke. They're never coming in touch with it. And it's in those instances where it gets quite a bit worse. But that's like really very few tables play that way. Almost no one, frankly, that I know. I have seen like one group of people that have really tried to munchkin and make the crazy hard, super challenging DM side, crazy challenging player side. Everyone's got nuts builds games.
Nice.
It's just not what 5e really is built for, and you can see that. But yeah, if you're like a middle ground, it's good. It's fine.
You mentioned earlier spike growth, good for druids, not so great for rangers.
Poor
You-
Rangers.
you've got some
I like
opinions on Rangers.
good. Yeah, I've got a lot of opinions
Yeah,
on the half casters as general.
right.
It comes down to, right. So spellcasting as a mechanic, they took they as in Wizards of the Coast, took a pretty clean and easy design route. It's relatively simplified compared to things like fourth edition was, from my understanding of it. It's reminiscent of like the old 3-5 ways, and that is that spells are linear in their power based off of their spell rank or spell level. So a first level spell is always going to be it's supposed to be about as good as every other first level spell. Second level spells are all supposed to be equal, third, etc. The reason this is a problem with half casters is by the time you get your second level spells,
Right.
your friends have had those second level spells for 3 levels now. By the time you get your fifth level spells, your friends have had those for 9 levels now. And
Right. What are you, like
no,
a 17th level ranger by the time you get level 2 or 3 spells or something?
yeah, at a 5th level, you get your first, second level spell as a ranger. Your wizard's casting fireball, doing 86 damage in the same
Right.
area, killing everything in sight, and you are getting to set a trap that might do 2d4 damage. Ugh, that's a lot worse. Whenever you're doing it at 3rd level, whenever you're fighting monsters that are the first level goblins, the first level zombies, the early tier little minions that are stuck on the ground, that are going to run at you with their swords, they're going to try and stab you to death. When you're fighting those monsters, it's fine. And that's where druids get it. They get it at 3rd level. That's kind of the window you have to use it. Spike Growth is a spell that doesn't get better as the game progresses. It gets worse.
Right.
You're less likely to use it because it needs your concentration. So you don't, like, as you get higher level, better spells that require your concentration, that just defaults over Spike Growth. Why would I cast Spike Growth when I need to cast this other thing I'm concentrating on? That compiled with the fact that 2d4 damage doesn't scale very well. D4s are often worse, not often, they are worse scaling numerically than every other dice. Groupings of D4 have a lower, if you add 2d4 comparing to add 2d6 to something, you are not adding as much damage.
Yeah,
And
that makes sense.
yeah, the spell doesn't scale well. Rangers get it later. On top of that, Rangers already want to be concentrating on Hunter's Mark a lot of the time. It's really consistent. It lasts a long time. If you're already not getting hit to maintain concentration, you'd almost always rather have something that's guaranteeing you damage in some way, shape, or form. It's just, there aren't realistic windows where, as a 5th level Ranger, I'm super excited to cast it. You'll have sometimes, if you're playing the attempted trapper, you want to control the environment as well as be somewhat of a scout. It can fit that play aesthetic. It's just, it comparatively, you get it later, it's worse in your class because it eats a concentration slot that's more important to you oftentimes than it is for druids. It just, all of the things, it happens too late and too poor for it to be good, in my opinion.
Well, let's say, for the sake of argument, well, we're talking about Spike Growth, so if we're forced to use it, what are some ways we can get the most out of it?
Sure, you don't even have to be forced to use it. Some people just like so they see something like this and they're like, oh, this appeals to me. I want to make this my playstyle. How do I make that work? The easiest way to do it is the Druid Cantrip Thorn Whip. That's a really easy way. It's something steps into it, takes 2d4 damage, goes, I'm taking damage. I'm aware of this invisible trap that's now poking me. I'm going to stop moving. And then you say, actually.
Oh, I forgot it's invisible too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, invisible, but yeah, it's hard to detect, right?
Right.
So then the druid just goes, okay, on my turn, I'm going to Thorn Whip that fella, and you want him through the Spike Growth, and now your Thorn Whip is doing a d6 plus 2d4, which is really, really good compared to every other cantrip in the game. Granted, you spend a second level spell on your concentration and a whole other bunch of baloney around it, but that's an easy way to weaponize it a bit more. It's also the kind of thing where your party members, if they don't already have something better than 2d4 damage to do, pushing somebody is great. You can shove somebody 5 feet or 10 feet, one of the two. That's a bunch of damage they're now taking just being yeeted through the Spike Growth, because that's just how that mechanic works. You can just spend one of your fighter's attacks to push somebody, free damage. It doesn't even necessarily, once they are moved, they just take the damage. There's no saves, there's no nonsense, it just happens. So it's consistent.
And there's other moving spells as well, like what is it? Gust of Wind, is it? And
yes.
Thunder Wave.
Yeah, Thunder Wave's a classic. It's also one, if you take it with like Arcane Initiate or something, you can be everything moves through it, then you go, actually, I'm going to push you all back into it, and then they just get meat grindered. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, you got like a barbarian on one end and a druid on the other, so you could have your little ping pong match.
And this is unfortunately like white room, nothing else exists in the world.
Right.
We've just got this perfect scenario, and that almost never happens. Spike Growth is going to be very good in very specific environments, and they're going to come up rarely. So much so that you'll probably stop preparing it after you hit 5th level. But in those environments where they are, and in the environments where you do manage to have your wizard pal cast your Gust of Wind, and you do knock 12 creatures back through it after they've just trudged all the one way, and you dealt 16 d4 damage, and everyone's like, they all died. It was insane. That's a story you're going to remember for a while. And it'll happen maybe once every few campaigns, and that'll be awesome. But it's not something that you can like realistically expect to happen. Whereas with Thorn Whip, at least you can be somewhat certain you'll get something out of it. That's the most likely case to sort of empower the spell, is just allies pushing or someone thunder waving a few creatures in. You'll get some neat little extra mileage out of those spells. It's not by any means game warping power. We're not creating a build that like is dealing maximum damage per round, but it's cool. And it's a nifty way to sort of interact with the spell.
Sure. All right. Overall, what rating would you give Spike Growth?
Spike Growth is fine. It's kind of what I can't ask for much more out of a second level spell. It does something. It will often mitigate movement. It will, in specific situations, it's very good and it'll shine very brightly and you'll be happy you had it. It doesn't scale very well, which isn't necessarily a problem because as druids or prepared casters, you can kind of get rid of it later. And rangers, I mean, you have to learn spells as rangers, but you can easily replace it down the road. So it's not like the end of the world if you don't want it anymore and have to replace it. So as a middle of the road, if we're going to give it a score, and who doesn't love arbitrary scores, I'm going to put this one straight in the center, 3 out of 5. This is a fine spell that you will find some use for, but won't in any way, shape, or form be something you fall back on constantly.
All right. Well, thank you. I guess that's Spike Growth.
Yeah, it's a decent spell. Try it out. It's like not going to change your life, but it's pretty cool.
I'll give it a whirl. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Thank you for watching. If you found this helpful, informative, or entertaining, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button below. You needn't smash it. A gentle tap will suffice. If you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to the channel. And make sure you check out the links in the description where you'll find my Caverns and Creatures series of comedy fantasy novels, our full review of the spell, and other fun things.